There we go. Fish on. Oh, this is a big one. Oh, yes. Oh, oh yeah. Holy crap. Oh, man. Heavy fish. All right. Oh, just fat. Oh, my God. Oh. Holy crap. This thing is gigantic.
Welcome to Dan's podcast, Fly Fishing and Stuff. FlyFishDan fun fact. When it comes to Dan's YouTube channel, he is a one-man show. He does all of his editing, all of his filming, stills, thumbnails, everything, all on his own without any type of help from anybody else.
And now here's the man, FlyFishDan.
Obscenely fat. Holy crap. Wow. Look at the size of this thing. Holy crap.
So one of the things I really enjoy doing, there's a couple of highways in Washington State that are not open year-round. They go over some pretty high passes in the Cascades. So I get out my motorcycle and I just take off for the evening, and we're on a Friday night, right? It's almost sundown. There's not another person on the road. I can have this entire highway to myself. And if there's any other motorcycle enthusiasts out there, you know how tough that is to find, especially in the crowded world that we live in today, to be able to find a road that you can just ride, probably 60 miles up and 60 miles back, and you have the entire highway to yourself. It's just pretty dang marvelous. And I figured this was probably a pretty good backdrop to talk a little bit about fly fishing and have episode 6 of Fly Fishing and Stuff podcast. So thanks for joining me tonight. And I brought myself a lunch, so I'm gonna have something to eat while we talk. So what we're gonna talk about today in this podcast are all the different types of fly fishing that you can do. So you might learn something new if you've been doing this for a while in this particular podcast, because I'm going to talk a lot about different tactics and strategies that I've used both in lakes and in rivers that have garnered me success. So that's what we're going to talk about. But if you just give me a second, I'm going to grab a sandwich, my go-to peanut butter and jelly. I'm going to make sure it's recording. Okay, I'm recording, because that would suck to have an entire podcast where I'm not actually recording. So it's not often I'm at a river either without my fly rod, but as you can probably see, this river is completely blown out. We are in full runoff, and really any type of river fishing is non-existent this time of year. So a lot of times I'll target lakes until the rivers open up and settle down a little bit. So if you're really new to fly fishing, you're going to discover that there are 3 types of fly fishing, right? You have the topwater action, or using dry flies, which there are a lot of people out there that just exclusively fish dry flies. Don't get me wrong, I love catching fish on a dry fly, but I also like catching fish. So I'm fine with using nymphs or using streamers, leeches, things like that. And that leads me to the second thing, right? You can fish nymphs both in rivers and in lakes, and we'll talk a little bit of some strategies on how to catch fish in those situations. And you can use streamers. And there is a technique to streamers, and Kobe was kind of against it for a while, but now on the last couple of trips that he's got into some streamer fishing and caught some really big fish on streamers, he's kind of hooked. He's not a streamer junkie by any means, but I always have a setup with me with a streamer on it, because that's really an effective way to catch fish. Especially fish that are predatory, like cutthroat trout, brown trout can be really aggressive. So if they see another fish in their area, they're going to want to eat it. So with that being said, let's first talk about dry flies. Now, you can catch fish on top in lakes, fish on top in rivers, and it's really fun when it's on a dry fly. In lakes, a lot of times you'll have some hatches that come off lakes, and you kind of have to pay attention to what's going on, because at times You might have a midge hatch, which are a smaller hatch. You might have some mayfly. You might have some calbatis. You might have a lot of different bugs. Now, I know it can be very complicated because there are about a zillion different species of bugs on this planet. Hatchpedia, by the way, is a great app that you can download. It's only like $3 a month, super inexpensive, that can help you identify some of these hatches that are happening on a lake or on a river. So check that out. However, what I found, you don't always have to exactly match the hatch, right? There are a lot of patterns, like the parachute Adams could really imitate a lot of different dry flies. And I primarily use the parachute Adams. I use a fly called the gray wolf, and some of the bigger patterns, we'll talk about it, more stimulator patterns. But those two patterns in different sizes can really imitate a lot of different flies. And if you have a fish that's keyed in on a particular fly, sometimes if you get close to the size and shape, you can garner success. In fact, I was at one of my favorite rivers recently, and there was a fish across from me that was consistently coming up and eating something. I looked on the water, I can kind of see some bugs over in the bubble line floating by, but I could not identify what they were. So I ended up tying on 5 different flies until I finally found one that fish was able to eat. Whether or not it was a pre-emerging drake that they were actually eating, it's hard to say. Probably not, based off of the time of year. It was kind of early spring when I caught that fish, but it was close enough for that fish to eat it. And he was on the eat too. I mean, he was a happy fish eating. So if I got something that was close to imitating what he was looking for, I ended up catching the fish. And another strategy you can do as well is I try to target kind of the riffles or unsettled water, right? If you have a very smooth surface on the water, no wind, just glass calm, you do have to be more diligent in matching the hatch. But a lot of times the bubble lines, they're turbid. The water's a little bit turbid. There's a little bit of some waves and movement and the current. You've got some bubbles. You can kind of disguise the fly that you're throwing and if you're close enough to the shape and size, a lot of times the fish will eat it. So you don't always have to perfectly match the hatch, right? I have been in some blue-wing olive hatches that if you don't have a blue-wing olive pattern, you're not going to catch fish. I mean, there are times that they're so specifically keyed in that you do have to really get something close. But what I have found, or almost exact, I should say, but what I have found, you can find a dry fly that's close in size and shape and garner success. Not always, but the majority of time I've been very fortunate to catch a lot of fish on top by just getting close to what I think might be happening on the river. So I don't want you to get stuck in the minutia and all the, stuck in the weeds, as I call it, with dry flies and think that you have to have 2,700 different dry flies in your box. If you have some of the basic patterns, like parachute Adams, everyone knows that, right? It can really imitate a lot of different bugs. The gray wolf, I love that fly. It can imitate mayflies, and a lot of time it's just a stimulator. And blue-wing olives you want to have in your box. Some caddis patterns you want to have in your box if you have some fish that are really keen on that. A lot of times you'll have some specific hatches, like drake hatches. You're gonna want to have some drake patterns in your box. But play around, keep tying on different flies, and eventually that fish is going to eat it, because that's how I've garnered success on a lot of dry fly fishing I've done. Now, one of my favorite times of year is when they don't really give a crap, right? The fish is going to eat the biggest thing it sees sitting on top, and that's probably the absolute funnest time of year is when they're eating those giant terrestrials, right? It doesn't matter. I've caught some fish in places that you shouldn't have eaten dry flies. A big salty lake in my area and big cutthroat trout. Kobe figured it out, right? The fish kept trying to eat the indicator, so he tied on a great Chernobyl ant, and I was like, you better tie on a dropper because I don't think you're going to catch any fish, because this fishery was notorious for having to be subsurface. But we were turning fish around on this lake with these giant foam bugs, big erasers, my buddy Jeff and I call them. That truly is the funnest time. And I have found that prior to the big hoppers and big terrestrial season and after, the fish I believe there's a trigger mechanism, and if they see that and it's close enough to the window of time to where they start seeing it, they'll still eat it. I've caught beautiful fish on dries as late as November. So I want you to experiment, right? When you're out there, there's nothing wrong with tying on a hopper late fall, early winter, and you'll be surprised of what might happen. So don't always get stuck in a rut of what you think, this is what I got to time because this is the time of year. Experiment and you're going to figure it out. But when you're in rivers, try to think like a fish, right? The fish don't want to expel a lot of energy when they're in the river. So think of all the places that you could go, kind of hang out in not such swift water, right? Generally, fish are not just sitting in the swiftness of water because it takes a lot of work to keep them in their place. So they're hiding behind rocks, they're in seams, they're in areas that the current is a little less powerful than the rest of the river. So if you're targeting rocks, even the cushions in front of rocks, seams, that's where the water kind of slows down, two different speeds combined. A lot of times they're hanging right there in the seams. Even in swift water, if they're big enough rocks in that swift water, fish will be hanging down towards the bottom behind that rock, and then they'll come up and grab something that swims by. So think like a trout and cast your fly all over the river in those areas. And bubble lines too, right? That's the conveyor belt for food in a river, are bubble lines. Now, if you're fishing a lake, if you've just started with fly fishing, and even people that have fly fished a while, I see this so often. Don't go out in the middle of the lake. I know that we've been programmed maybe it was in our youth, right? My dad used to take me out to Hart's Lake and we just roll right out in the middle. So I think sometimes lake fishermen get in their minds that I've got to be right in the middle of the lake. Now, I'm not saying that you're not going to catch any fish in the middle of the lake, but you're not going to catch as many as along the edges, right? Get to know your lake. Sometimes you'll have lakes that'll have a steep edge that drops off. Fish will hang out there, right against the shore. There's some lakes, some mountain lakes that my buddy Jeff and I fish. We've cast in 6 inches of water right against the shore from a boat and caught fish. These fish sometimes are in the middle of the lake, but most of the time they're hanging around the edge. They're trying to ambush prey. They're hiding under logs. They're hiding under rocks. They're hiding in weed beds on the edge. They're hiding just off the shallow water. Sometimes they're just chilling right in the shallow water. I catch 90% of the fish right on the edge. Doesn't matter where I'm fishing in lakes, they are near the edges. So a lot of times I just chuckle when I see guys out trolling in the middle of the lake, and you might catch a couple out there, but the majority of fish are hanging out on the edges. They like the structure, they like hiding spots, they like to ambush. Things are falling off trees, bugs are falling off trees, they're waiting for that to happen. That doesn't necessarily happen out in the middle. Occasionally you're gonna get one rising out there, but really spend some time in and around the edges of the lake. And top water and mid-water. So let's talk about the second thing, and that's nymph fishing. So typically when people are thinking about nymph fishing, they're thinking rivers. But I've used nymphs, river nymphs, in lakes and have found success, right? If I have a really slow day, they're not eating the typical chironomids or San Juan worms or soft tackle or even leeches, I'll tie on a river type of nymph and catch fish in lakes. All right, so there's one thing that I had to interject here. The audio might sound a little different because I watched the podcast back and I thought I need to talk a little bit more about the lake type of nymph fishing and chironomids. So there are nymphs specifically for lakes, swimming nymphs. Damselfly nymphs are something you should always have in your box when fishing lakes. Dragonfly nymphs as well. Sometimes soft hackle. I've even stripped back a TJ hooker or a squala nymph and had success on lakes. So you want to have some river nymphs, but also have some specific swimming style nymphs in your box as well to find success. And of course there's the chironomids, right? Chironomids and San Juan worms are some of the most effective flies for stillwater fishing. You should always give that a try. And a lot of times I have a San Juan worm and a chironomid dropper, and that is just lights out. Vary your depths. Make sure you're, paying attention, right? If you see a lot of fish swirling right below the surface, you may want that chironomid only maybe 2 feet off of the indicator you don't see a lot of activity, then you can go more towards the bottom. But prospecting is super important when fishing lakes with really any type of fly. Dig down to find out where the fish are hanging out. All right, back to your regular scheduled program. But typically when you're fishing nymphs that's subsurface, it's happening in rivers. And generally you're gonna need some sort of indicator. Now there are a lot of indicators to choose out there, from New Zealand indicators that have kind of the wool. There are the airlocks that have, the cap on top, and then you have Oros indicators. So now I use Oros exclusively. I don't have any affiliation with them. They're great people, family-owned company. They've sent me a few indicators, which is very cool. Thank you very much. I'm running low. I've given them a lot away, by the way. But the Oros indicator, because the line goes right down the middle, it doesn't have a tendency to twist, right? If you have the airlocks, sometimes from casting a lot, they'll twist on the line and you'll have just this big twisted mess, and now you're tying on a new leader or tying some tippet onto the end of your line. So check out the Oros indicator. They really are a brilliant design when it comes to indicators. But anyway, when you're fishing nymphs in rivers, many times you're fishing two at a time, right? Generally the regulations will allow you to fish two flies at the same time. It doubles your chances, right? My go-to nymph, no matter what time of year, is a TJ hooker. It is a kind of a swallow fly. It can imitate a salmon fly larva. It can imitate a stonefly larva. That TJ hooker in variation of sizes has been lights out. It doesn't matter what time of year. It doesn't matter what type of hatch. The fish seem to key in on that fly. In fact, I just fished the Big D and caught some beautiful red sides on that fly. And actually I took off the dropper because no one was going after the dropper, so I just had a single fly. But a lot of the times, 95% of the times, tie on a smaller nymph below that bigger fly, because it gives you, two things for the fish to look at, and you'll have a better chance. Now, a little tougher to cast a setup like that, right? You are going to need to learn how to water load, which essentially is allowing all of the stuff to land in the water. You pick it up, set it back down again, and that helps you avoid tangles. So be sure to learn how to water load. It just makes casting that setup easy. But when you're fishing these double nymph setups, don't be afraid to constantly vary your depth. Now typically you want to be 1.5 to 2 times longer from your indicator to your first fly to the depth of the water that you're fishing in a river, depending on how swift it is. So, there's always a rule of thumb, but I like to experiment. Sometimes the fish are higher up in the water column and they're looking for food higher up, so I'll start shallower, right? Even if I have a stretch of river that I'm fishing that I know is probably 3 or 4 feet deep, sometimes I'll put the indicator maybe only 2 feet above the first fly, and I'll prospect. If I don't get anything after the first cast, I'll lower the indicator down. If I don't get anything again, I'll lower it down. Now you can tell if you start snagging on some rocks or the bottom, now you're right at the bottom, so maybe I'll adjust the indicator a little again. But I'm constantly experimenting and prospecting for fish in a river with my double nymph setup. So there are a ton of river nymphs. My biggest go-to on the big one is that TJ hooker. Typically, I've got that thing on no matter where I'm fishing. I've caught personal best red sides on that, like this one. I've caught personal best Wessel cutthroats on that fly, like that one. I've caught some incredible fish on that fly, no matter what time of the year. That's generally my first fly. Second fly, I'll vary it up, right? I love the flashback pheasant tail. It's one of my favorites. The red copper john, just small flashback nymphs. There's some purple nymphs with legs that are kind of nice as well. Those are, they're really imitating something specific sometimes, but generally those are my go-to nymphs, because that's typically, even if the fish aren't targeting something absolutely specific, they're gonna still eat that fly. But don't be afraid to fill your box with several different variations, some of which look good for the fly fishermen, but a lot of times they'll work. But experiment, right? Typically I'm keeping on that big fly, and I'll retie every 20 minutes or so the bottom fly if I'm just prospecting and trying to find something that might work. But you can kind of see by my nymph box here, I have a lot of variations just so I can experiment with. So mimic what I got here, have a full box of these smaller nymphs, some with beads, some without, Typically I'm fishing beads because I like to get them down, and I don't like using split shot. I think they kind of mess up your leader. And a pro fly fishing tip, by the way, on the dropper, right, from the big fly on that dropper, use one less lighter tippet. So if you're using a 4X tapered leader, use 5X for the dropper. That way, if you get hung up on the bottom, you are less likely to lose both flies. You'll just lose the lower one if it can't get off the stick or the rock. So I always size down one on the dropper, just for, you know, the hope that I'll get both flies back, or at least one of the flies back if I snag on the bottom. So let's talk a little bit about streamers. You can use streamers both in lakes and in rivers. In fact, Kobe and I have had some tremendous days on lakes using streamers. A lot of times with lakes, it's smaller streamers. Like, one of my favorite things to use, and it's really not a streamer, it's more of kind of a, you know, it's a leech pattern. They're a balanced leech. The guy that designed these, I don't know, 20 years ago, out of Spokane, Washington, whatever reason, the balanced leech, when you're stripping that in because of where the hook shank is located, it just does something different than a typical woolly bugger. It just gives a little more action as it's pulling through the water. Balanced leeches really are my go-to when I'm fishing lakes and I want to try to prospect for something swimming below the surface. But don't be afraid to tie on a great big sparkle minnow or a great big sculpzilla, or maybe just this giant black streamer articulated with a green eyeballs. Experiment, right? A lot of times fish are looking for a bigger meal, especially early on in the spring. And even if they might be eating cronobits, they'll be opportunistic. I always have a rod with a streamer on it so I can tie either balance leeches. Jig leeches can be really good with a tungsten head so they get down pretty deep, or giant patterns, streamer patterns. So don't be afraid to use those and experiment. Have a rod set up the next time you're fishing your lake with a streamer. You'll notice, right? I've got two rods with me always. When I'm fishing rivers, I have a setup that's usually with a wet setup, either a nip setup or a streamer, and I have a dry setup. So I'm always fishing two rods because I like to be able to have quick access. And that O-Pro's third hand, that thing has been great. I love that thing because it keeps it out of the way. It's out of my casting hand. I've occasionally snagged it, but very rarely. The convenience of having a second setup, the convenience of having a second setup to be able to switch from quickly, it is so worth the occasional pain in the butt that it comes along with it. Man, it's getting dark already. For those of you just listening, I'm literally sitting on the side of a highway right next to this beautiful river and a waterfall behind me. Seriously, you need to check out my YouTube channel and find this podcast on YouTube. It just visually, there's a lot to look at. It's absolutely gorgeous out here. I just love living in the Pacific Northwest. I mean, I live in a pretty special place, and here's why. I mean, this is an hour away from my house. Just amazing. Anyway, so use streamers, use leeches, have a setup when you're fishing lakes. Now, one thing I've gotten into a lot more, and I found that they're big fish flies, right? I will use streamers in rivers now all the time. Sometimes it was hit and miss. I would, you know, if I felt there was nothing happening on top. I was really into nymphing early on. And then I just had, I had an opportunity to fish a particular river here in Washington. And I don't want to hotspot, but somebody told me, said, hey, you need to tie on a sculpzilla, a sculpin pattern in here, and just spend a day prospecting in this river, and you'll be surprised what you might catch. And now I use that sculpzilla, I mean, all the time. And I have caught some ridiculous fish with the sculpzilla. I mean, it is a big fish fly, no doubt about it. So bring the sculpzilla, right? And that, if you had one streamer to fish in rivers, it would be the sculpzilla. It doesn't matter where I'm at, no matter what state that I'm in, size of river, tiny creeks, big giant rivers, the sculpzilla works everywhere. And I've done, you know, occasionally I'll do a sparkle minnow or I'll change it up to different flies. But my go-to is the sculpzilla, and I rarely ever tie anything else. I do kind of a Duncan loop knot on there to give it a little more action. But you can use a standard clinch knot as well. if you're using the Sculpzilla. But really, bring those, try those next time in the river, swing them, but when you're done swinging the hole, do an upstream cast. In fact, I just talked to Fidalgo fly fishers and was talking to a guy about one of our mutually favorite rivers, and he was talking about how somebody at Red's Fly Shop said, hey, just throw it upstream and strip it back. That is the upstream cast. I've been preaching that nonstop on my channel. It is effective. For whatever reason, there's a trigger in the fish's head, right? When they see that fish trying to escape downstream, they'll just charge after it, and the hits are explosive. So the next time you're out in your favorite river, it's tough to keep your handle on it, right? You're stripping back as fast as you can. But hey, that's kind of fun, right? Because typically trout fishing is a little more delicate. You're just pulling this back as fast as you can, trying to keep a tight line. And those fish will come hammer it. I mean, it's so many times that's happened to me. So swing your favorite spot, do that, but then cast upstream just before you go and do an upstream cast. And I think you'll be pretty surprised on what might happen if you do that. So we covered dry flies, right? There's a lot of similarities between rivers and lakes. You can use a lot of the same flies and garner success. Keep an eyeball on what's happening, but you don't always have to match the hatch. Have enough dry fly selection in your box to where if you get close to the size and kind of variation, you're gonna have success with dry flies. Nymphs, don't be afraid to use nymphs in a lake. I have found success on slow days that they're not eating chironomids or San Juan worms or squirmy wormies or leeches. Throw on a nymph in a lake, you might be surprised. And when you're fishing rivers, seriously, your first fly should always be that TJ hooker. Green or brown, different sizes, you can experiment. It's a great fly to get everything down too because it's super heavy. And then have a box of different variations of nymphs to tie on as a dropper. Remember to always vary your indicator depth. Start off shallow, prospect your way down. You're gonna find success. And there's another video I just recently did too. Don't be afraid to do the long drift, right? I almost peel out the entire spool of fly line for my fly reel when I'm fishing bigger rivers, and I let that indicator go down a country mile. The whole fly line is out. I maximize my drift when I'm in especially bigger rivers with a nymph setup. And the hook set's a little harder when you got that much line out, but a lot of times you can't reach those spots because maybe it's a drop off and it gets deep, or maybe you have things in your back cast that's in your way and you can't walk down and fish that same section. Do the long drift with your indicator setup and I think you might be surprised. Pleasantly surprised. So next time you're out there, do the long drift. I think you might be happy with what might happen and the success you'll garner from doing that. A lot of times I'll see fly fishers out there and they're throwing it a little bit upstream and they're maybe letting it go down 40 feet and that's it, almost tight lining it with an indicator. Let that sucker drift down there. Try to keep things mended and as tight as you can, and then just get ready for a turbo hook set at the end when that indicator moves. But I've caught some ridiculous fish that are 80 feet downstream from me, so don't be afraid to do that. And then finally, you can also mix up nymphs and dries. Everyone's probably heard the hopper dropper setup. That is a popular setup, especially when you're fishing during the months that fish could be looking up for the bigger terrestrials, but maybe it's early in the morning, maybe it's later in the afternoon. Tie a dropper, a small nymph dropper, usually about 12 to 18 inches, sometimes 24 inches below the big hopper. It optimizes and maximizes your chances of catching fish. Sometimes it's gonna get tangled up. A lot of times, there's another pro tip for you. So instead of tying that second fly on the hook part of the hook, tie it on the eye. It gives the top fly a more natural presentation. Because if you can imagine, if there's like a line or a rope tugging on the back end of that dry fly, a lot of times it just doesn't really act right? It's sitting weirdly in the water, that it's pulling it down into the water and it's awkward. Nymph's the same way, right? It doesn't give that free-flowing feeling of the nymph drifting downstream if something's tied right on the curve of the hook. So tie your tag line to the eye of the hook and you're gonna have a lot more success and a lot less tangling up if you do that. So pro fly fishing tip for you. But you can do both, right? You can have a dry and a nymph dropper if you're prospecting for fish And a lot of times if they're eating the dry nonstop, I just take the dropper off because it gets in the way and snags on the fish and sometimes makes a mess. So, but it's a great way to kind of do both. So we covered dries, get as close as you can to match the hatch. It doesn't have to be perfect, just close. Have a good selection of flies that you can experiment with when you see a hatch happening on the river or on the lake that you're on. Nymphing, right? Vary things up. Try streamers, right? Have a couple of setups. If you only have one fly rod, maybe this is an opportunity for you to get another fly rod, whether it's a 3-weight, if you already have a 5, maybe it's a 6-weight, so you can throw a little bit heavier streamers. But get a second rod so you can have 2 setups. It just makes it so much easier to switch back and forth. And the last thing we didn't talk about was sink tips. Now, when you go to the fly shop, there are so many sink tips. Now, I am realizing with steelhead fishing and Skagit lines, you do need to be pretty specific in trying to find that right depth to get down to a steelhead. But generally, when trout fishing with a sink tip, I'm using between a 6 and 9 foot fast sinking sink tip, and I'll just kind of vary my presentation to find the right depth. But I don't get stuck in the weeds and have all these different sink tips. I use one sink tip generally, and most of the time I don't use it. I rarely use the sink tip, and I still catch a ton of fish. If I need to get further down in a lake, instead of trying to get down there with a sink tip, I'll just tie in a 12-foot leader, sometimes even a 15-foot leader in a heavy fly and get down there. I sometimes use sink tips, but not often. I really do like the control of topwater action, but have one fast sink tip in your box at any given time. Sometimes when you start collecting a lot of gear, you could have an entire reel dedicated to sinking line. There are some fisheries that you're gonna need it, but in most cases, I rarely use sink tips. Whether I'm in a river or if I'm in a lake, I'm just using longer leaders and heavier flies to get down, and I still garner success. Occasionally, it's good to have one just in case. Sometimes the fish are just really stubborn and really deep, and you gotta get down there to get them. So I'll have a fast sink tip or a reel that's dedicated with a fast sinking line on there. Kobe has fished some intermediate line and has had some success. But you know, I matched him on a recent fishery. He was using an intermediate with a fly. I just had to put a longer leader and a heavier fly and wait a little longer for that fly to sink down, and I was still garnering success. Now granted, he was having a little easier time of it with his intermediate, but I still found success by just lengthening the leader and made the fly a little bit heavier. All right, so I think that pretty much covers, right, the 3 different ways and some of the combinations that you can do. Don't be afraid to experiment, right? Think outside the box. Try something new. You might be shocked at the stories you're going to be able to tell your buddy about what you were able to get into and how you're able to catch the fish. All right, well, it's starting to get dark, so I'm going to get back on the motorcycle and head back home. But thanks for joining me on another podcast. I really appreciate it. And until the next time, everybody, fish on.
Want to ask Dan a fly fishing question? You can do just that in the comments below on YouTube or good old-fashioned email. Send your question to flyfishdan@gmail.com.